The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the usual blend of translated voices, and each species contributed to the cacophony of interstellar politics. Commander Jacob Hayes stood at the human delegation podium with his hands gripping the edges as he presented humanity's latest archaeological findings from the ruins on Kepler 442b. He had been preparing this presentation for weeks, and he knew that what he was about to show could change everything they understood about galactic history. Jacob continued speaking and projected holographic images above the assembly. These markings appeared throughout 17 different star systems, and he believed they represented something truly significant. The symbols were intricate and precise, and they appeared on structures that predated any known civilization by millions of years. A dismissive click echoed from the Velkari representative, whose name was Ambassador Threlnak. His mandibles twitched in what Jacob had learned was their equivalent of a condescending smile. The ambassador spoke with clear disdain in his voice. Those symbols had been documented for over 3,000 cycles, and they were simply geological formations. Perhaps they were created by ancient stellar winds or crystalline growth patterns, but they were certainly meaningless. The Drayan ambassador was a floating being of luminescent gas named Orvel, and it pulsed in agreement. The humans were new to the galactic community, and they saw patterns where none existed. This enthusiasm, while charming, was wasting the council's valuable time. Jacob felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his composure. Beside him stood Dr. Lisa Monroe, who was humanity's chief xenoarchaeologist. She placed a calming hand on his arm, and her green eyes remained fixed on the hologram. She was studying the intricate patterns of lines and curves that covered the ancient stone tablets they had discovered. Lisa interjected with respect in her voice, but firmness as well. Humanity had catalogued over 200 distinct variations of these markings, and they appeared on structures predating every known civilization in this sector by millions of years. The mathematical precision alone suggested intentional design rather than random natural formation. The council chamber filled with a chorus of dismissive sounds from various species. The Krell representative was a massive reptilian creature named Gornseth, and he leaned forward in his suspension chair. His people had explored these systems when humanity's species was still learning to make fire. They had found nothing but empty worlds and ancient rubble. If there was meaning to be found, his people would have discovered it long ago. Jacob exchanged a glance with Lisa, and they had expected resistance, but the sheer unified dismissal stung more than he cared to admit. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for only 23 years since the EUR. Velkari First Contact mission had arrived at Earth. In that time, humans had proven themselves capable engineers and soldiers, but their scientific contributions were often met with patronizing tolerance. Jacob spoke firmly and requested permission to continue their research. 6 months was all they asked, and they wanted to explore the remaining sites and compile a comprehensive database of the symbols. Ambassador Threlnak's head tilted, and his compound eyes reflected the chamber's soft light. He agreed to approve the request, but warned them not to return to this council with fantasies of lost civilizations and ancient mysteries. The galaxy had real problems that required their attention. The session ended with the customary formalities, and Jacob and Lisa made their way through the winding corridors of the council station. The structure was a masterpiece of cooperative engineering, with sections designed to accommodate dozens of different environmental requirements. They passed through a methane-rich zone, where the Havrex conducted their business, and then into a gravity-inverted section favored by the Quellen. Lisa muttered once they reached the human quarters. They thought humans were children playing with toys, and the dismissal was clear in every delegate's voice. Jacob replied that they would prove them wrong. He told Lisa to contact the research vessel Aurora and have Captain Stevens prep for a long-range expedition. They were going deeper into the outer reaches to find more evidence. Lisa nodded and pulled up her datapad. She would also reach out to Professor Alan Carter at the Lunar University. His team had been working on pattern recognition algorithms that might help them decode these symbols. Over the next 3 months, the Aurora traversed the edges of known space and visited dead worlds and abandoned structures. Each location revealed more of the mysterious markings, and with each discovery, Lisa's team grew more convinced of their significance. The symbols appeared on everything from megalithic stone arches to metallic plates embedded in asteroid fields. Lieutenant Commander Kevin Brooks was the Aurora's tactical officer, and he had become unexpectedly invested in the search. During off hours, he could be found in the archaeology lab, helping Lisa's team catalog and cross-reference the findings. His military training gave him a unique perspective on the patterns. Kevin pointed to a three-dimensional map he had constructed one evening. If you plotted all the locations where they had found these markings, they formed a network. It wasn't random at all, and it looked almost like navigation markers or waypoints. Lisa leaned over his shoulder and her eyes widened. Kevin might be onto something important. What if these weren't just records or art, but what if they were directions pointing to something specific? The possibility reinvigorated the entire team. Dr. Nathan Pierce was a linguist, specializing in dead languages, and he began approaching the symbols not as writing but as coordinates. Within weeks, his algorithms detected mathematical relationships between the symbol clusters that corresponded to stellar coordinates. Nathan announced during a briefing in the Aurora's conference room that he thought he knew where they were pointing. The holographic display shifted to show a region of space beyond the galactic rim. It was an area marked as unexplored and potentially hazardous due to unstable gravitational anomalies. Captain Helen Gardner was a no-nonsense officer with 20 years of deep space experience. She studied the map with her arms crossed. That was the void edge, and no one went there. The gravitational shears would tear apart any ship that got too close to that region. Lisa suggested that maybe that was why no one ever found what these markings were pointing to. Every other species took one look at the danger and wrote off the entire region as inaccessible. Jacob asked with a slight smile, "What about humans, though?" "What would humans do in this situation?" Helen replied while returning the smile. Humans were stubborn and apparently crazy enough to fly into a gravitational meat grinder. She asked when they should leave for the void edge. The decision was made quickly. The Aurora would make the journey to the void edge and follow the coordinates that Nathan had decoded from the ancient symbols. They would need to prepare carefully because the gravitational anomalies in that region could destroy the ship if they weren't cautious. Helen ordered her crew to begin preparations immediately. Lisa spent the next few days double-checking Nathan's calculations. The coordinates were precise, and they pointed to a specific location deep within the void edge. Whatever the ancient builders had hidden there, they had chosen one of the most dangerous regions in the galaxy to hide it. That alone suggested it was something incredibly important. Jacob contacted them via holocom from the council station. He wanted to know if they were certain about this course of action. The risk was substantial, and if something went wrong, the council would likely use it as further proof that humans were reckless. Lisa responded that they were certain. The evidence was clear and the mathematics were sound. Something was waiting in the void edge, and humanity had come too far to turn back now. They had to see this through to the end. The journey to the void edge took 6 weeks, even with the Aurora's upgraded quantum drive. As they approached the designated coordinates, the ship's sensors began registering the chaotic gravitational fluctuations that had kept this region unexplored for millennia. Space itself seemed to ripple and distort, creating visual phenomena that made the crew dizzy if they stared too long at the viewports. Lieutenant Amy Foster sat at the helm, watching her displays with growing concern. The gravitational stress was increasing with every kilometer they traveled, and she had to constantly adjust the field stabilizers to keep the ship from being pulled apart. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, but sweat beaded on her forehead. She wouldn't want to stay in this region longer than absolutely necessary. Captain Helen Gardner stood on the bridge with her hands clasped behind her back. She had spent 20 years in deep space and had seen many strange things, but this region felt different. The laws of physics seemed to bend here in ways that made her uncomfortable. She turned to Nathan Pierce, who was studying his console with intense concentration. Nathan looked up from his screen and met her eyes. His face was pale, but his voice was steady when he spoke. The mathematics were solid, and he was certain about the coordinates. Whatever the ancient builders wanted people to find, it was definitely here in this nightmare of twisted space. Helen nodded and gave the order for a full sensor sweep. They needed to find anything that didn't belong in this chaos, structures or energy signatures or spatial anomalies that went beyond the baseline madness surrounding them. The crew worked in tense silence as the Aurora crept forward through the distorted space. Each person was aware that one miscalculation could send them spiraling into a gravitational vortex from which there would be no escape. 3 hours passed with agonizing slowness. The sensors strained against the interference and the ship groaned under the gravitational stress. Then Kevin Brooks spotted something on his tactical display. He called out the coordinates and everyone on the bridge turned to look at the main screen. At bearing 273 Mark V, there was definitely something artificial out there. The main screen focused on those coordinates, and gradually an image began to resolve through the distortion. What appeared left the entire bridge crew speechless. Floating in the heart of the gravitational chaos was a station, or perhaps a city. It was massive and easily dwarfed any structure that humanity or the known galactic species had ever constructed. The architecture was unlike anything in the records. It was composed of smooth flowing curves that seemed to defy the laws of physics as they understood them. The structure wasn't being torn apart by the gravitational forces that should have destroyed it instantly. Instead, it appeared to be using those forces and riding the waves of distorted space like a ship on a cosmic ocean. Lisa Monroe had rushed to the bridge when she heard the commotion. She stood staring at the screen with her mouth slightly open. It was real, and it was actually here after all their searching and all the doubt. The ancient station that the symbols had been pointing to for millions of years. Helen asked about life signs, though her voice carried little hope. Amy checked her sensors and reported negative, but there were power readings. They were faint but definitely present, and that meant something inside that structure was still active after all this time. Jacob Hayes appeared via holocom link from the council station. He had been monitoring the mission remotely, and his excitement was clear even through the holographic projection. He told Helen that this was her call, but if there was any chance of learning what was inside that structure, they needed to take it. Helen agreed and ordered Amy to plot an approach vector. She told her to use the gravitational currents instead of fighting against them. If that station had survived here this long, there must be a stable path to reach it. The next hour was the longest of many crew members' lives. Amy proved her worth as a pilot by threading the Aurora through the gravitational maze with a combination of instinct and mathematical precision. Several times alarms blared as stress on the hull approached critical levels. Each time Amy found a way to navigate clear, and the ship survived another close call. Finally, the Aurora settled into a stable orbit around the ancient structure. Up close, its scale became even more apparent. The station stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Its surface was marked with the same symbols. They had been chasing across the galaxy, but here they glowed with a soft pulsing light. Kevin scanned for docking ports and found one that looked surprisingly compatible with their airlocks. Nathan made an interesting observation that maybe their airlocks were designed to be compatible with this station. Perhaps these builders had influenced more than anyone realized. A team was quickly assembled for the first exploration. Lisa and Nathan from the science division, along with Kevin and 2 security officers. Dr. Craig Murphy, the ship's chief medical officer and biologist, also joined them. They suited up in full environmental gear, with each suit equipped with recorders and communication equipment. When the airlock cycled open, Lisa felt her heart racing. This was the moment every archaeologist dreamed of, and she was actually stepping into a truly unknown environment that could rewrite history. The station's interior was dark at first, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, lights began to activate. They ran in sequences along the walls and ceiling, creating a path forward. Nathan's voice filled with wonder as he spoke. The station was responding to their presence, and after millions of years, it was still responsive and functional. The implications were staggering. The corridor they entered was vast and clearly designed for beings much larger than humans. The walls were covered in the familiar symbols, but here they were 3-dimensional. They rose from the surface in intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Lisa followed the flow of the lighting system. She had a feeling the station was guiding them somewhere specific. The group walked for what felt like hours through corridors and chambers that defied easy description. Some rooms appeared to be living quarters, while others resembled laboratories or command centers. All were empty of any remains, and whatever species had built this place had left no trace of themselves behind except their incredible architecture and the ubiquitous symbols. They emerged into a chamber so large that their lights couldn't reach the far walls. In the center stood a structure that resembled a combination of a computer console and a sculpture. The symbols here were different and more complex than anything they had seen before. They were layered upon one another in ways that suggested depth and meaning beyond simple decoration. Nathan spoke reverently. This was it, and he knew it immediately. This was what the builders wanted them to find. The central hub or archive or key to understanding everything they had been searching for. Lisa approached the console carefully with her gloved hand hovering over the surface. She asked if she should touch it, and there was a moment of hesitation among the group. Kevin had his hand resting on his sidearm more from habit than any perceived threat. He pointed out that they had come all this way and they should see what secrets had been left behind. When Lisa's hand made contact, the entire chamber erupted with light and sound. Holographic projections filled the air, showing star maps and mathematical equations and biological diagrams. Scenes of civilizations rising and falling played out around them. The data flow was overwhelming and too much to process in real time, but their recorders captured everything. Then amidst the chaos of information, a single sequence began to repeat. It showed the galaxy at different points in time with billions of years compressed into minutes. They watched as stars were born and died. They saw species evolve and reach for the stars, and they saw something else moving through it all. A presence or intelligence that existed beyond normal space. It was observing and occasionally interfering with the natural flow of galactic evolution. The sequence ended with a warning that was conveyed not in words but in pure conceptual information that bypassed language entirely. The meaning was absolutely clear to everyone watching. Something was coming, and it was something that the ancient builders had fought against. They had failed to stop it, but they had hidden this knowledge here in the most inhospitable region of space they could find. They were hoping that someday a species would be curious enough and stubborn enough to find it. Lisa stood transfixed as the information washed over her consciousness. The builders had left them more than just a warning. They had left detailed information about what was coming and how they had tried to fight it. There were technical schematics and theoretical models and desperate last attempts at creating a defense. The holographic display continued to cycle through its information, and the team stood watching in silence. They all understood that they had just discovered something that would change everything. The galaxy faced a threat that had existed for millions of years, and they were the first ones to actually find the proof. The return journey to Council Space felt longer than the trip out, despite taking the same amount of time. The Aurora's databanks were filled with massive amounts of information from the ancient station, and Lisa's team worked around the clock to organize and interpret the findings. What they discovered was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Jacob insisted over the comlink that they needed to present this immediately. The council needed to know what they had found, and there was no time to waste. The information was too important to delay. Helen countered with exhaustion evident in her voice. They wouldn't believe the report, and Jacob had seen how the council reacted to their initial findings. Now they were going to tell them about an ancient super-civilization and an impending galactic threat. The delegates would laugh them out of the chamber. Lisa said firmly that they had to make them believe. They had proof, and they had data, and they had an entire station's worth of technology that they could lead them to if necessary. Jacob scheduled an emergency session of the Galactic Council and invoked humanity's right as a member species to call for immediate assembly. The response was predictably grudging. When Jacob and Lisa entered the chamber 3 days later, they were met with barely concealed annoyance from most of the assembled delegates. Ambassador Threlnak was the first to speak. He trusted that Commander Hayes and Dr. Monroe had something of genuine importance to share. Calling an emergency session for another presentation about ancient graffiti would be most inappropriate. Jacob ignored the slight and activated the holographic display. 3 months ago, they had followed the trail of symbols to their origin point in the void, Edge. What they found there changed everything. They knew about galactic history. The display showed the station in all its impossible glory floating in the gravitational chaos. The assembled delegates leaned forward, and their various expressions of interest were briefly unified. Jacob continued and showed footage from inside, the station and the activation of its systems, and finally the data archives. Lisa explained that this structure predated all known civilizations by at least 50 million years. The species that built it achieved a level of technological advancement that made their current capabilities look primitive by comparison. And they had left a message for whoever found it. The hologram shifted to show the warning sequence with the rise and fall of civilizations and the presence that moved through them. Lisa continued speaking and told them the builders called it the Harbinger. It was a force or entity that existed partially outside their dimension, It moved through the galaxy in cycles, and each time it caused extinction-level events. The builders tried to stop it and failed. They left this archive as a warning for whoever came after them. The chamber erupted into chaos. Some delegates expressed disbelief while others demanded to see the raw data. A few simply laughed at what they perceived as human naivety and foolishness. Gornzeth, the Krell ambassador, raised his massive clawed hand for silence. When the chamber quieted, he spoke in his deep, rumbling voice. He respected human enthusiasm, but this was pure fantasy. The Krell had records going back 30,000 years, and they had never encountered evidence of this harbinger, or any cyclical extinction event. Nathan interjected, and his voice cut through the murmurs. That was because they were too young as a species. All of them were too young to remember. The Velkari had existed as a spacefaring civilization for 8,000 years. The Dran for 12,000 years. The Krell for 30,000 years. The cycle occurred roughly every 60 million years. Their species didn't exist during the last event. Ambassador Orval pulsed with what Lisa had learned to recognize as irritation.
Yet somehow humanity had uncovered this cosmic secret in their mere 2 decades as members of the galactic community.
The arrogance was truly astounding. Jacob said with his voice hardening that it wasn't arrogance at all. It was pattern recognition. Humans had a tendency to look at things differently. They didn't have millennia of preconceptions telling them what could and couldn't exist. When they saw evidence, they followed it even if it led them to uncomfortable places. Threlnak said dismissively that they meant uncomfortable fantasies. He advised Commander Hayes to focus on practical contributions to the galactic community. They should leave the ancient mysteries to those with the experience to interpret them correctly. The session ended without resolution. The Council agreed to review the data, but made it clear they considered the entire matter a waste of resources. As Jacob and Lisa left the chamber, they were intercepted by Captain Paul Anderson of the Earth Defense Fleet's flagship, the Titan. Paul said he had been watching the proceedings. He believed them for what it was worth. He had spent 40 years in space and had learned to trust his gut. Something about this whole situation felt real to him. Jacob thanked the captain, but pointed out that belief didn't help if they couldn't convince the council to take action. They needed resources and cooperation from all the member species. Paul suggested that maybe they didn't wait for the council. Humanity had resources of its own. They could mount their own investigation and prepare their own defenses. If this threat was real and it arrived, they would need to be ready whether the galaxy believed them or not. Over the next 6 months, a quiet but determined effort began. Human scientists, with cooperation from a handful of sympathetic researchers from other species, worked to decode more of the ancient archive. They discovered technical schematics for defensive systems and warnings about specific spatial anomalies that heralded the Harbinger's approach. Most importantly, they found clues about how the ancient builders had tried to fight back. Dr. Claire Sanders was a theoretical physicist who had joined the project. She made a breakthrough after weeks of studying the technical data. The builders didn't think of the Harbinger as a physical entity, or even a conventional energy being. They described it as a resonance or a fundamental frequency that disrupted the quantum substrate of their reality. They were trying to build a counter-resonance as a way to stabilize space against its influence. Lisa asked if they succeeded in their attempt. She needed to know if there was hope. Claire shook her head. Not entirely, was her response. The data suggested they managed to create a partial defense that was enough to delay the Harbinger, but not stop it completely. They ran out of time before they could finish. But humans had their research now. They could build on it and maybe finish what the ancient builders started. The work continued in secret facilities on Earth and its colonies. The official galactic community remained skeptical and occasionally sent passive-aggressive inquiries about humanity's sudden obsession with theoretical physics and deep space sensor arrays. Jacob and his team deflected these questions because they knew that full disclosure would only result in mockery, or worse, and possibly active interference. Meanwhile, in the depths of space beyond the galactic rim, instruments designed by Claire's team began to detect something unusual. There were subtle distortions in the quantum field that were barely measurable but growing stronger with each passing week. The patterns matched the ancient warnings perfectly. Lieutenant Commander Beth Taylor sat in the Deep Space Monitoring Station at the edge of the Terran sensor network. Her eyes were fixed on the data streams that flowed across her displays. It was tedious work watching for anomalies that rarely amounted to anything significant, but recent weeks had seen a disturbing trend that couldn't be ignored. She muttered to herself as she flagged another spike in the data. That was the 5th one this month, and they were coming more frequently now. Her partner, Ensign Greg Mitchell, looked up from his own console. He asked if it was the same pattern as before, and his voice carried concern. Beth confirmed it was identical. Quantum field distortions at frequencies that shouldn't exist naturally. Claire Sanders was going to want to see this data immediately, and they needed to send it through encrypted channels right away. The data was transmitted to Earth via encrypted channels, and within hours, Claire Sanders stood in the Earth Defense Force Command Center. She was presenting her findings to an assembled group of military and civilian leaders that included Jacob Hayes and Admiral Sandra Cole, who was the head of Earth's Space Forces. The room was filled with tension as everyone understood the gravity of what they were about to hear. Claire explained that the distortions were consistent with the Harbinger's approach signature as described in the ancient archives. They were still years away from the main event and possibly decades, but the precursor effects had begun. The ancient builders documented the same phenomenon before their encounter with the entity, Admiral. Sandra Cole was a woman whose career had spanned from Earth's first tentative steps into space to commanding fleets that patrolled multiple star systems. She studied the data with a critical eye and asked how certain Claire was about this timeline. Claire admitted 73% confidence in her calculations. The archives weren't complete and they were extrapolating from incomplete data. But everything they were seeing matched the builders' descriptions perfectly. The distortions would grow stronger and more frequent as time went on. Eventually, they would begin affecting inhabited systems, Jacob added with frustration, evident in his tone that the Galactic Council still didn't believe them. He had sent them quarterly reports with all the data they were collecting. The Council filed them away and sent back polite dismissals each time. Sandra leaned back in her chair and her fingers drummed on the armrest. Then they would proceed as planned without waiting for Council approval. She asked how the defense project was coming along. Claire pulled up another set of displays showing construction, progress on 3 massive installations, in orbit around Earth and Luna and Mars. The resonance generators were 60% complete. They were working from the ancient designs, but they had to innovate quite a bit. Their technology base was different from the builders, which meant they needed to approach some problems from entirely new angles. Sandra asked bluntly if the generators would work when the time came. She needed to know the truth. Claire admitted she didn't know for certain. The builders had thousands of years to refine their technology. Humanity was trying to accomplish in a few years what took them centuries. But if they didn't try and this thing arrived as predicted, they would have nothing to defend themselves with. Over the next 3 years, the distortions grew steadily worse. Human monitoring stations began detecting effects in deep space that were deeply troubling. There were sudden dead zones where quantum communication failed completely. Spatial tiers appeared and vanished without warning. Most disturbingly, several uninhabited stellar systems completely disappeared. One moment they were there on all the sensors, and the next moment, there was nothing but empty space where stars should have been. It was this last phenomenon that finally caught the Galactic Council's attention in a serious way. Jacob and Lisa were summoned to an emergency council session, and the tone this time was completely different. There was no dismissiveness and no condescending patience. The assembled delegates looked genuinely worried for the first time since humans had joined their community. Ambassador Threlnach spoke first, and his usual confidence was visibly shaken. Commander Hayes and Dr. Monroe, they had reviewed the recent spatial anomalies. The patterns appeared to match descriptions in the human ancient archives. Jacob confirmed that they did match. The Harbinger was approaching, and they had been monitoring its effects for 3 years now. Everything was happening exactly as the ancient builders had warned. Orval pulsed with what Lisa recognized as agitation. 3 years meant humans had data for 3 years and didn't inform the Council properly. Why had they kept this information from them? Lisa replied sharply that they had informed the Council quarterly with detailed reports. Their reports were dismissed as speculation and fear-mongering. Anyone could check the Council's own archives if they had forgotten the warnings. An uncomfortable silence fell over the chamber. No one wanted to admit they had ignored the human warnings. Gornseth was the one to break the silence with a simple question. What did they do now? Jacob said they needed to prepare immediately. Humanity had been working on defensive systems based on the ancient builders' research. They weren't complete, and no one knew if they would actually work, but they were better than doing nothing at all. Threlnak said to show them everything, and for the first time since humanity had joined the galactic community, he spoke without a trace of condescension in his voice. The presentation that followed outlined 3 years of secret research and development. Claire Sanders was brought in via HoloLink, and she explained the theory behind the resonance generators. She described the quantum stabilization fields they were designed to project. The idea was to create pockets of stable space that could resist the Harbinger's reality-disrupting effects. Claire explained they had built 3 prototype generators in the Terran system. They were untested at full power because they were afraid of what might happen if something went wrong, but simulations suggested they could protect a planetary system and maybe several systems if they networked them properly, together. The Velkari chief science advisor was a younger member of Threlnak's species named Velmoth. He studied the data intently and spoke with concern. The mathematics were sound, but the power requirements were absolutely enormous. Even human fusion reactors couldn't sustain this level of output for more than a few hours. Claire acknowledged they knew about the power problem. That was their biggest limitation at the moment. They needed more efficient power sources. The builders used something called zero-point energy taps that directly accessed vacuum fluctuations. Humanity understood the theory, but hadn't been able to replicate the technology yet. Velmoth said they could help with that problem, and he looked to Threlnak for confirmation. The ambassador nodded slowly in agreement. Over the following week, something unprecedented happened in galactic history. The Galactic Council, motivated by genuine fear for the first time in living memory, began to coordinate a unified response. Species that had viewed each other as competitors or barely tolerated neighbors started sharing technology and resources freely. The Krell contributed their expertise in megastructure engineering. They showed humanity how to build on scales that had previously seemed impossible. The Drayan, being beings of pure energy, offered insights into quantum field manipulation that solved several of Claire's most stubborn theoretical problems. The Havreks, who were methane-breathing industrialists, opened their extensive manufacturing networks to the production of components. Human ingenuity combined with galactic resources produced results that seemed almost miraculous. Within 18 months, the 3 prototype generators in the Terran system had been upgraded and expanded significantly. New installations began construction in key systems throughout the galaxy. Each one was designed to protect a cluster of inhabited worlds from the approaching threat. But even as the construction progressed at an incredible pace, the distortions continued to worsen. The Harbinger was coming closer, and the time frame was shrinking faster than anyone had predicted. The warning came from the deep space monitoring network that humanity had established years earlier. Beth Taylor was now heading a joint species observation team, and she detected the massive quantum disturbance first. Her instruments showed readings that were off every scale they had. She transmitted on all priority channels. This was it, and there was no more time for preparation. The Harbinger had arrived in their galaxy, and everything they had feared was now reality. The phenomenon appeared at the galactic rim, where the density of stars thinned and gave way to the vast intergalactic void. Sensors showed a distortion in space-time so massive that it affected light-years of territory. Stars near the distortion began to flicker and fade, but they weren't dying in the traditional sense. They were simply ceasing to exist and being erased from reality by forces that defied conventional physics. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, but this time every delegate listened intently as Jacob Hayes outlined the defense plan. There was no more doubt and no more dismissal. The threat was real and visible to everyone now. Jacob reported that they had 42 resonance generators online across 17 key systems. Each one was networked with the others and creating a web of stabilized space. The theory was that the Harbinger couldn't affect areas where the quantum substrate was locked into their reality. They would become invisible to it, or more accurately, indigestible to its nature. Gornzeth asked the question everyone was thinking. What happened if the theory was wrong? What if all this effort was for nothing? Jacob admitted honestly that then they would have wasted a lot of time and resources. But at least they tried, and that was better than waiting helplessly for destruction. The Harbinger moved through the galaxy like a wave of unreality, and its path seemed random, but relentlessly consumed everything it touched. Entire systems vanished in moments and billions of lives were snuffed out in an instant. The member species of the Galactic Council evacuated populations from threatened worlds. They funneled refugees to the protected systems where the resonance generators were active. Earth and Luna and Mars became one of the primary sanctuary zones. The 3 original generators had been upgraded into a network of 12 units. They created a stable bubble of reality around the entire Terran system. Refugees from a dozen species flooded in, and their ships filled orbital space. Life support systems strained to their limits, but everyone worked together to accommodate the survivors. Lisa Monroe worked around the clock coordinating the scientific response. The ancient archives had provided warnings and theoretical defenses, but they had also hinted at something else that seemed impossible. The possibility of communication with the Harbinger itself. She explained during a strategy session that included representatives from every major species. The builders tried to understand the Harbinger rather than just fight it. They didn't think of it as evil or malicious, but as something fundamentally alien. It existed partially in their dimension and partially in others. It didn't perceive reality the way organic life forms did. Nathan Pierce had been studying the linguistic aspects of the archives for years. He added his findings to the discussion. The symbols and the markings they found across the galaxy weren't just warnings or coordinates. Some of them were attempts at a universal language, something that could bridge the conceptual gap between normal matter-based life and whatever the Harbinger actually was. Admiral Sandra Cole asked the crucial question. Could they use that language to talk to it? Could they negotiate or convince it to go around them instead of through them? Nathan said carefully that maybe they could. But they would need to get its attention first, and that meant letting the generators drop for a moment. They would have to make themselves visible to it intentionally. The room erupted in debate. Some argued it was too dangerous and that dropping the shields even briefly could result in the instant annihilation of the protected systems. Others contended that it was worth the risk if there was even a small chance of ending the threat without further loss of life. Ambassador Threlnak suggested a compromise. What if they dropped the shields in a system that was already evacuated? They could use the generators there to send a signal and see if they got a response. If they lost that system, at least no one would die. The plan was approved by unanimous vote. The chosen system was Kepler 442b, which was the very place where humanity had first discovered the ancient markings. There was a poetic symmetry to it that Lisa appreciated even as she felt sick with worry about what might happen. A team was assembled quickly. Lisa and Nathan and Claire and Kevin Brooks, who insisted that someone with tactical training needed to be present. They traveled to Kepler 442b aboard the Aurora, which was now upgraded with some of the most advanced shielding technology the galaxy could produce. The resonance generator in the system was set to a special frequency. It was derived from the linguistic patterns that Nathan had decoded from the ancient archives. It would pulse in a sequence designed to convey concepts of awareness and intelligence and desire for communication. Then for exactly 10 seconds the shield would drop and make the system visible to the Harbinger. Captain Helen Gardner asked from the Aurora's bridge if everyone was ready. The ship was positioned at the edge of the system and ready to jump to faster-than-light speed at the first sign of danger. Lisa replied that they were as ready as they would ever be. Her hand hovered over the activation control and her heart was pounding. The sequence began. The generator pulsed with complex mathematical patterns translated into quantum field fluctuations. Then the shield dropped and they were exposed. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. For 7 seconds, sensors showed the Harbinger's attention turning toward them. It was a massive distortion in spacetime that seemed to pause and focus on their location. At 8 seconds, something unprecedented occurred that no one had predicted. The Harbinger responded to their signal. The reply came not through conventional communication channels but directly through the quantum field itself. It bypassed the need for electromagnetic signals entirely. It was pure information and concepts and meanings that pressed into the minds of everyone aboard the Aurora. They were like memories that weren't their own but were somehow being shared. The Harbinger was old and older than the universe in its current form. It existed across multiple dimensions and moved through them as easily as humans moved through three-dimensional space. What appeared to organic life as destruction was from its perspective a form of maintenance. It was pruning dead branches and clearing away quantum tangles that accumulated as universes aged. Nathan said with his voice filled with wonder and horror. It didn't understand that they were alive. To something that existed across dimensions, they were like patterns in sand. Beautiful maybe, but temporary and ultimately meaningless. Lisa felt tears streaming down her face as she grasped the enormity of what they faced. How could they make it understand that they mattered? That they were more than just patterns? Claire, ever the scientist even in the face of cosmic terror, studied the data streaming from the encounter. They had to show it somehow. They needed to demonstrate that they weren't just patterns, but something more, something that mattered and had value. The shield snapped back into place at 10 seconds as planned. The Harbinger's attention drifted away and resumed its path through the galaxy. But the team had learned something crucial. It could perceive them and it could respond, and most importantly, it could be influenced. Back on Earth, a new plan was formulated with input from every species. Every resonance generator in the galaxy was recalibrated to broadcast a unified signal. Not just a message, but a demonstration of complexity and growth and self-determination. The combined consciousness of billions of beings would all broadcast their existence simultaneously. When the Harbinger reached the core systems where most of the galaxy's population had taken refuge, it encountered something different. Not cowering victims, but a coordinated display of life's complexity. Every generator pulsed in harmony and created patterns of meaning that spanned light years. Music and mathematics and art and philosophy were all expressed in the language Nathan had decoded. The Harbinger paused. For the first time in the recorded history of the universe, it stopped its advance and considered what it had encountered. The wait was agonizing. Hours passed and then days dragged on. The Harbinger remained at the edge of the protected systems and neither advanced nor retreated. Scientists across the galaxy monitored every quantum fluctuation and looked for signs of what might come next. The answer came in a form similar to the message the team had received at Kepler 442b. But this time it was clearer and more refined. The Harbinger had adapted its communication method to better interface with three-dimensional minds. Understanding and recognition flowed as pure concepts. The Harbinger acknowledged them as something more than temporary patterns. Life was complexity that created new complexity. It was a process of growth that added value to the universe rather than mere entropy. The massive distortion began to shift and move away from the inhabited regions. The Harbinger would continue its cosmic maintenance, but it would avoid the pockets of organized complexity that constituted life. In its own incomprehensible way, it would be careful where it stepped. As the crisis passed and the distortion finally vanished back beyond the galactic rim the member species gathered on, Earth and Ambassador Threlnak approached Jacob and Lisa with genuine respect. He owed them an apology. When they first brought the findings about the ancient markings, he dismissed them. He was wrong. The galaxy was safe not because of any single species' strength, but because diverse minds had worked together. The truth had been hidden in those ancient markings, but humanity had found it. And in